Hello, everybody. My name is Phanish Puranam. I am the Roland Berger Chair Professor of Strategy and Organization Design at INSEAD, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on AI as a force for good in international organizations. This webinar is part of our Tech Talk X series and run by Digital at INSEAD. This series is really an ongoing set of conversations with thought leaders in technology, in business, and organization around cutting-edge current themes. And today I'm particularly glad to host a stellar cast of co-panelists to talk about the role of AI in international organizations. I will introduce my co-panelists in a bit more detail in a second, but let me also point out that this is meant to be a very, very interactive webinar. You are free to put in questions in chat at any point, and our entire team will be keeping track of what's going on, and we will try and get back to you and have explicitly time in the end for more Q&A. My co-panelists today are Professor Tina Ambos of the International Management University of Geneva, Catherine Tatarinov, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Geneva, Maria Novkovic, who's Giga program manager at UNICEF. And the three of us, plus me, together are going to talk about AI as a force for good in international organizations. Today's talk is really about artificial intelligence in international organizations. Now, if you've been wondering what international organizations refers to, we are talking about organizations like the United Nations, like the World Bank, like the various arms within the United Nations. Each of those itself is an international organization. So these are really organizations which are, in some sense, dedicated to furthering the well-being of the world. At the same time, they also are a very unusual and interesting context for the adoption of cutting-edge new technologies like artificial intelligence. So a couple of years ago, we began this project with colleagues like Catherine, Tina, and also Ruth, who's now at the World Economic Forum, to do a deep dive into how are artificial intelligence initiatives being taken up in these international organizations. How successful has their adoption been? What are some typical challenges that come up when trying to adopt these technologies in that context? And here's the part that got me excited really as a business school professor. What can we also learn from this fairly special context about the adoption of AI that might then translate and travel back into the world of for-profit business organizations as well? In a business school like INSEAD, we've always been equally interested in for-profit and non-profit organizations. They're all organizations, and we are management professors. But it was particularly interesting to see how much of a spillover there would be between the ideas in the for-profit world and in the non-profit international organizations world. I want to spend not a lot of time, but at least a few minutes to make sure everybody in this webinar is up to speed on what we mean by AI, artificial intelligence. It's a very complicated topic, and in fact, we run entire courses at INSEAD on this. In fact, I launched INSEAD's Transforming for Your Business Through AI program, which is a fully online program. And we teach this extensively in our MBA and exec ed programs. But what I want to do is give you a very quick, non-technical introduction to what exactly all the fuss is all about. Because artificial intelligence as a technology is actually not that new. It's been around for at least 50 years, maybe more. And it was called artificial intelligence for all these decades. But what's really new about the new AI, which is really machine learning, is worth thinking a little bit about. So here's a very simple way to explain the difference between the old AI and the new AI. Think about how one would teach a child how to do long division. That's the image on the left. So it's a series of rules, right? We start with a number, we put in a divisor, we divide, we take the difference, we take the remainder, put it on the top, and you know the drill. And if you follow the process correctly, then you have successfully completed long division. That's how old AI used to work, where you had to bake in the rules that the algorithm would then execute. And the advantage of putting it into a computer really was that the execution was flawless each time and could take place at enormous scale and enormous speed, and obviously at very low cost in terms of processing. Now, that's very different from the way new AI works, which is really about learning patterns from data. And here the analogy I think that you might bear in mind is closer to having a child learn how to ride a bicycle. I can't give you a set of rules on how to ride a bicycle. What I can do is give you a set of experiences of riding the bicycle, supported by me, And through the trial and error process of making mistakes and learning from the feedback, the child learns the subtle art of balance. I can't write down the rules for balance, but in their mind, they can infer the rules based on the feedback they're getting. This is what makes the new AI so powerful. It's no longer necessary for humans to be able to explicitly articulate rules. If there is a pattern in the data, the algorithms can find it. And if the algorithms can find it, they can then use it to make predictions. This is what makes the new machine learning-based AI so different and so powerful compared to the old AI. Just think about it for a second. If the only way an algorithm could replace a human is if we could write down the rules and code them in under the old AI, then of course it was easy to imagine that a lot of the highly skilled work that humans currently do, which cannot be written down as rules, are completely immune to take over from AI. However, if we are now in this new world where the algorithms can actually learn patterns from data, it's not necessary for the human to have to write down the rules or even be able to write down the rules. As long as there is a pattern in the data, the algorithm can find it and potentially use that to make predictions. A different way to make the same point is to show you this example. This is the kind of high school exam question that you either hated or loved, depending on what kind of a student you were, but it's really about pattern detection. So I give you a bunch of hearts and then a circle and then hearts, and your job is to come up with a prediction on what's coming next, right? So you see the pattern here, you know the next one's going to be a circle, and in the next line, you know it's going to be a square, and so on. That is exactly how modern machine learning works. Okay, obviously it's a much more complicated version of this, but the core idea is given enough data, and if the data has a pattern, the algorithms can find it. Once it's able to find the pattern, it can use that to make predictions about what's coming next. And predictions, as we know, are extremely powerful. Why? Because every decision we ever make requires a prediction. Every decision. If you're choosing between buying a car, different varieties of a car, or you're choosing between investing in stock, buying a house, whom to date, these are all decisions. And in each case, you're making implicitly a prediction about what would be the outcome if you did 1 versus 2. If you can make those predictions accurately, obviously your decision quality improves. Now, today, what's happening really with these machine learning-based AI is 4 classes of applications. Predictive analytics, let's start with that one, is really about using past data to make predictions about things like who is likely to become a customer, who's likely to stop being a customer churn, for example, who is a credit-worthy risk, who's not, who's likely to consume more during a particular period, and which credit card transactions, for instance, are likely to be fraud. These are all examples of predictive analytics. On the bottom right, you see image recognition. This is the world as seen by a self-driving car. That's how it's easy. Okay? So it's classifying each of these into different categories, which is car, which is bicycle, which is a person, and so on. This is image recognition. On the bottom left is natural language processing, which is also about detecting patterns, but now it's in text. So we look for patterns of co-occurring words. We look for patterns in sound that correspond to particular words. And we use those patterns to make good predictions about what is this person saying or what are they talking about. That's NLP, natural language processing. And finally, at the top left is perhaps the least glamorous, but actually perhaps the most important applications of machine learning-based AI, which is just simple workflow automation. Things that humans used to do repetitively, one after the other, sometimes based on explicit rules. And then, of course, old-fashioned AI can already solve the problem. But sometimes, even if the work was repetitive, even though no rules were written down, now the machine learning-based algorithms, as I told you, can discover those rules from the data and effectively offer a replacement or a substitution for human drudgery. So these are the 4 broad classes of algorithmic AI applications today in most organizations, whether it's for-profit or for non-profit. That's the promise. It turns out in practice that while the promise is spectacular, and this is one way to visualize it, which I really like. This is called Hans Moravec's landscape, and it occurs in Max Tegmark's 2018 book, which I strongly recommend, called Life 3.0. What this picture is showing you is a landscape in which everything in the water refers to things that algorithms already do better than humans. Okay, so everything that's underwater, machine learning already does better than humans. The higher the peak, the harder it's going to be for machine learning to effectively do what humans do today. So things like writing a book, cinematography, art, management, social interaction. These are things that as of today, machine learning is quite far from doing effectively. But things like driving, playing Go, playing Jeopardy, playing chess, arithmetic, vision, these are things that already algorithms do far better than humans. So it's a very exciting area. It's also a very scary area. As a species, we have to worry about our own competitive advantage in this new world of algorithms. But if you go back from this promise to the reality of companies actually adopting AI, it turns out adoption is not easy at all. Okay, you're going to hear a lot more from my colleagues on the specific challenges of adoption of AI in international organizations. But from what I've seen in my work with corporations in the for-profit sector, the two big things that always come up are first, skill. This is a new set of skills one needs, and traditional data scientists may or may not have these skills. So finding the talent to put in place the new AI-based applications is never going to be easy. Second, data. The new machine learning-based AI is very, very data hungry. And many companies actually don't have that great data around their business operations. So in my work, I focus particularly on organizational analytics, which is the use of data to make people-related decisions, the ethics of it, the analytics of it. And it turns out very often companies have much better data on their customers than they have on their employees. So this is the landscape as we stand today. Let me stop here and turn it over to Katya, who's going to talk us through the findings of this research along with team. Katya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phanish. So far, there has only been one question in the chat, one comment in the chat that I signaled to you. So I'll share my screen now. Thank you very much to INSEAD Digital for having us here today. So we'll present ourselves quickly. I'm Catherine Tatarinov, Managing Director of the Geneva Innovation Movement Association and postdoctoral scholar at the University of Geneva. And I'm here with my colleague, Professor Tina Ambos, who will present herself very quickly as well.
Sorry, Tina Ambos, very nice to meet you all. Thanks for being here with us today. So I'm Professor of International Management at the University of Geneva, and my research focuses on global strategy innovation in international dispersed organizations. The last couple of years, I've been specifically focusing on how to make the United Nations organizations, international organizations that are big, bureaucratic, international dispersed organizations that actually focus on social good rather than profit, how to make these organizations more innovative and how particularly to use technology on this journey of transformation. And the results that we're presenting today are collaborative work with Phanish at INSEAD and with many of the UN organizations. And we're very happy to share those results and hopefully have a thought-provoking discussion with you later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tina. So as we move ahead, Phanish broadly introduced what are the United Nations organizations and the context of our study here. These organizations focus on solving the world's grand challenges and addressing the sustainable development goals. AI has been shown to promise as digital solutions that are scalable and thus have the potential to address the wicked problems and help achieve the SDGs. These are problems that are local by nature, but need to be solved through a global vision. So we see a lot of promise in AI solutions as being one of the ways to help solve these challenges. And you can see here on the left an example of a satellite imagery detecting emergency situations after a flood to help understand how to prioritize emergency response. This is an initiative that came from the World Food Program. It's called SKY, and it uses satellite imagery and machine learning to help promote this response. What did we study here? We studied how these international organizations leverage AI, and we didn't look at this purely from a conceptual theoretical perspective. We actually looked at concrete examples of how these international organizations are currently using artificial intelligence. What we studied already starting in 2019 was over 110 different initiatives coming out of these international organizations. So they exist. These organizations are actively working on AI. And what we wanted to learn is how do these organizations leverage AI different than the private sector, and what are the similarities, as Phanish mentioned? And then also, what can different international organizations learn from each other? What are the best practices and what are the patterns, particularly in a managerial context, that we can elevate out of these use cases. Phanish described a four-way classification process, and this classification process was incredibly useful for us as well as we started to look at the different ways in which artificial intelligence was already being used in these international organizations. These classifications can add additional clarity and nuance to support informed decisions about when and how to apply artificial intelligence in the future. If we start the same way as Phanish started from the top right-hand corner on predictive analytics, I'll just highlight an example in each one of these categorizations. So in the first, in predictive analytics, UNHCR developed a project called Project Jetsons, which uses migration, which predicts migration and migration out of specific country, Somalia, using underlying data such as weather, political data, and economic data. What was very interesting is we really see the added value of the international organizations here, because one of the variables that they found that was important in terms of predicting this migration pattern was the price of goats in Somalia going up and down. What they found was that as the prices of goats dropped, they knew that people were selling their herds and were going to be migrating. As the prices of goats increased in neighboring countries, they knew that people were arriving in those countries. So this is something that only people working on the ground in Somalia would have known about. The second is the image and voice recognition. So this involves analyzing visual or auditory input to identify consistent objects or characteristics. I mentioned Initiative Sky from the World Food Program to identify response necessity. And this uses satellite imagery and deep machine learning to help understand how can we respond when you can't get people in directly into a disaster zone. How can you respond better? And so they figured out that satellite imagery was particularly important to be used here. And in general, in our whole study, we saw that currently many of the organizations are using satellite imagery predominantly for a lot of their AI projects, because this data is publicly available often and easy to access. Next is natural language processing. So UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund in Colombia, actually developed a project called ECHO. So this is natural language processing to analyze the perception, analysis, and generation of speech or text. And using this, the UNFPA in Colombia was able to use natural language processing to understand how people are reacting to the SDGs. How can we better use the language of the people there in the country to teach them about the SDGs and teach them how they can employ better response towards the SDGs in their lives. And finally, the least sexy, but perhaps the most interesting of the AI use case classification is workflow automation. We see workflow automation happening as well in the UN. For example, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, uses robotic process automation to create an AI article writing bot. So, there's a lot of reports and a lot of articles coming out of the UN. So this bot actually learns about how to write articles and uses natural language generation and machine learning capabilities to create content out of available data, such as meeting files and so forth, to allow the elimination of manual and redundant processes of creating standard organizational reports. So we see that a lot of these initiatives are already happening in the UN, already being driven forward, particularly for this humanitarian response. What was very interesting for us as well is we saw a fifth category developing, and this was capacity building. We know that the UN works quite a lot with governments and member states, and the UN is more and more taking on this role of deliberately working to develop the capacity of countries and organizations in an effort to prepare them to start implementing artificial intelligence initiatives as well. So we see them starting to take on this new role of actually helping the others as well as they themselves develop this capacity internally. As Phanish mentioned, not everything is easy to implement artificial intelligence. There were quite a few challenges that we noted as well, and these came from our conversations with innovation unit leads and people working on artificial intelligence within the United Nations organizations. We characterize these challenges in 3 groups. So there was a technical challenges, organizational challenges, and the contextual challenges related to the UN context. We, in this slide, would also like to present some workarounds for some of the challenges that we identified. Some of these workarounds are already being implemented by a few of the UN agencies as well. So the first challenge, which is also relatable in the private sector, data is expensive. And of course, top technical talent is hard to attract. What we see is that often there can be workarounds by using public data. I mentioned satellite imagery as being one of these types of public data. The second is broader partnerships. Data pooling can be used across the UN agencies. These organizations all use data that they see as sensitive, often on topics that are difficult to share information on. But if even within these UN agencies, there can be data pooling, this is already a huge step towards working around this challenge. The second is broader partnerships with other types of sectors, such as private sector and academia, using websites where you can actually help put on parts of your data and have help in coding some of this and developing some of these programs for yourself for free. Often private sector organizations are also willing to work for free for in-kind contributions, and academics are, of course, always willing to partner for in-kind contribution as well. In terms of the organizational challenges, we saw that internal communication was siloed, and often leadership was wary to take risks. We saw some of the initiatives that I mentioned have already been sundowned or spun off, actually, because of the risks addressed at the leadership level. What we saw some organizations doing to address this is creating knowledge hubs that can aggregate a lot of this information and act as touch points to go to within the organization when somebody wants to create a new artificial intelligence project. The second is actually to bring in the leadership team as owners on some of these projects and build a sort of lighthouse project where these leadership teams can actually be inspired and act as champions so that they come in as owners and are able to run with this themselves. And finally, contextually, we're dealing with a context that is very frugal and has a very human value-driven mindset. So often it's difficult to align the ethical mission of the organization with the risks of automated decision-making, particularly when human lives are on the line. And the ethical dilemmas around prediction and bias are magnified often in this context. The workaround that we suggest for this is actually to create a mindset shift towards using evidence-based and creating evidence through pilots and experiments that show the benefits of enabling AI in these organizations, not to take away the human aspect, but actually to augment people's jobs and enable them to do their jobs better through this new through this new data. And finally, what we're also suggesting is clear governance and process structures from the outset created within these organizations. As I mentioned, this capacity building role that the UN is now sometimes taking on, often we could imagine that the UN may take on the role of an ethical gatekeeper in artificial intelligence initiatives being developed by other organizations and actually using their own capacity and their own legitimacy globally to create this ethical governance structure for other organizations. So I hand it over to Professor Tina Embos now.
Thank you. And let me just, before I start with my part, respond to a few queries in the chat. There were issues about governance. There were issues about, the role of humans. Obviously, I mean, what all this implies, and not only in, in the social sector and international organizations, but also the for-profit sector, is that we need people with different mindsets. We need people with the ability to obviously work with technology, but also leaders who actually understand where technology is helpful and can be used and for what purpose. And I think what we're seeing across the board a little bit is this issue that, AI is this big, mystical thing that nobody really knows how to deal with it. Many managers are scared of it. So from the kind of the top to the bottom in organizations, I think we need to think very carefully about, what is the use of AI in our organizations, in our particular solutions, and how do we actually make sure that people who need to work with that and who are affected by those new tools are actually, you know, having the skills and abilities to really integrate this into their work. I'm hoping to address some of your questions regarding the governance and the role of, you know, what is the private sector, what is the public sector may be doing in this respect, by saying a few words about scaling, which we believe is a key concept for successfully implementing AI initiatives, because so far we've really remained at the organization level, but scaling is really, you know, a key ingredient for at least two reasons. First, as Phanish mentioned at the very beginning, AI is based on data, and it needs a critical mass of data inputs to actually work and to thrive here. Second, when we speak about these, you know, grand challenges, sustainable development goals, whatever you name it, we mostly are dealing with problems that are really locally embedded. So, such as the root causes of poverty or climate change. But at the same time, all these issues have to be addressed globally. They're globally intertwined. So, you know, poverty will lead to violent conflicts, will lead to migration. Obviously, climate change does not stop at the country borders. So we need both the local embeddedness as well as the global vision to address these problems. And this is where particularly we see the value of AI, because AI really has this tech core bone that can be replicated, but it can be actually transformed into many different applications to address local challenges. An example of an initiative from UNICEF, for example, they're using chatbots to address both problems of teenagers, where they actually answer educational questions, as well as for government engagement or community engagement for polling reasons. And the same digital technology is behind it, but then you can use the bots in very different ways for different applications, to the extent that they even answer in the same jargon and the same language that their user groups would actually prefer. So while we have this replication element of AI, there is a high level of local application that can address local problems as they need to be addressed. Another issue that is often overlooked is then, when we speak about AI applications, we usually think about one company, and here we speak about the UN, actually UN organizations like UNICEF, like the World Food Programme, like UNHCR, driving those initiatives, but in fact, they're not realizing those initiatives at all, right? Alone, sorry. What happens always is that solutions are embedded in ecosystems. So you need tech providers, you need big multinationals sometimes, you know, lead the scaling. You need local tech companies who support and service data points. You need often government support. You need donors for social projects. You need a community engagement. So in reality, this often results in what we call cross-sector ecosystems with cross-sector partnerships. And as we know from other fields of research, this is something that is notoriously difficult to manage. But what is very important, and I'll show this on the next slide, is that in this ecosystem that assembles here, we have different roles. And in the research we've done in the United Nations, the orchestrator role is always taken on by the United Nations agencies, but it can also obviously be another one. If we talk about ecosystems in the private sector, we usually think about the Amazons of this world as an orchestrator. And the role that the UN is playing here is very similar. It's basically about ideating and setting up the ecosystem, of bringing the different partners together. And here, in our context, the United Nations are playing a very important role to build the global legitimacy and actually activate this network that brings all the partners together. In addition, we need integrators, and often this is the private sector. Often these are either multinationals or local companies who help contextualize, provide local knowledge, access to partners, because behind all of these solutions, even if they address social problems, there needs to be a business model, a business case that makes it viable and stable for the solution to actually survive and add value to the beneficiaries. The third role is a complementary role, where it's basically about assistance on the ground, delivery to the end users, and this access to the beneficiaries. And often, I mean, as Catherine said before, we have, we're working with refugees here, with migrants. We're speaking about the value of a goat rather than about, the value of a stock market price. So we really need to make sure how these solutions connect to the end beneficiaries, and this is where complementers are needed. Why do we think it's important to speak about these different roles in the ecosystem? It is important because the governance and the capabilities that each of these organizations actually needs to bring to the table for the ecosystem to work is very important. So this is why we believe for successful implementation and adoption of AI, we need to think about solutions as being part of an ecosystem where different organizations take on different roles and bring together other players, be it for-profit, non-for-profit, be it government, be it NGOs, be it communities, that actually help to feed into this ecosystems and are equally motivated, but also capable of playing the role here. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Maria, who will give us a very tangible example from her work context of how UNICEF is managing some of these challenges. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Tina, for this wonderful segue into what I'll be sharing with you today. Allow me also to introduce myself to the attendees and to set the timer because I don't want to go over. My name is Maria and I am from Montenegro. It's interesting to know that I work for the Giga initiative. It's a joint initiative between UNICEF and ITU, and we have a very ambitious goal, and it gives me goosebumps every time I speak about it because of the scale and ambition that we aim to achieve. We want to connect every school in the world to the internet by 2030, and through that, every young person to information, opportunity, and choice. We like to self-identify as a startup emanating from the United Nations system. We rely heavily on technology tools. It's our primary way of solving a crucial problem the world is faced with. About half of the world's population is offline, and we all know how vital access to the internet is for all of us. Imagine living in complete digital darkness. That literally means that lack of internet access becomes the new face of poverty. Digital exclusion likely will reverberate and limit everyone's chances to thrive in this life. Giga really only does three things. We hope to solve a crucial information gap. Interestingly enough, no one knows how many schools there are in the world, let alone where they are. So we're trying to map them on an open source platform, which is also a digital public good. We try to help governments define the financing needed to achieve universal school connectivity, and we support them in creating access on the tenets of sustainability. I would also love to show a few practical examples of how we use technology in our work. I am having some technical difficulties, but let me tell you that we have managed to lean on technology solutions quite heavily to ensure that we can use the advantages of technology. We are a data project, but we also use artificial intelligence to accelerate the pace of mapping schools. We have built a few artificial intelligence models that have been tested at a country level and at a regional level. We've seen that country-based models work better, but regional models give us more scale. We have tested in Sudan an object detection model, and we're extremely proud to report 91% of accuracy in detecting schools. You could say that in this case, we were the orchestrator working with the government of Sudan and with UNICEF country office to use technology tools to solve this crucial gap. You could also say that we had support. We've had complementers and integrators. This level of precision and this speed of detecting objects or schools would not have been possible without the support of our private sector partner, Dell, who allowed us to use their high performance computing, which reduced the time to process satellite imagery of high resolution from a year to a matter of few weeks. Our goal now is to scale this AI model so that it could cover more areas rapidly. This was built actually based on a model that we tested in Colombia, and I hope you can see the animation. With this model in Colombia, we were able to assist the government to locate 7,000 schools that didn't feature in their data sets previously. Other applications of technology in the Giga initiative is real-time connectivity monitoring, which is ushering in a new phase of transparency and accountability. So whenever Giga manages to connect a school or a batch of schools to the internet, we insist on live connectivity monitoring, which is a way for us to track whether service providers deliver the service that they promise. There are a few ways for us to gather that data. We can use service level agreements with providers. We can install browser extensions. We also have data sharing agreements with ISPs. And latest and hot off the press, we have built an application that provides these types of insights at least 4 times per day. So the next iteration of our quest where we use technology for public good is and the news is quite exciting. We have managed to secure the backing of the government of Spain. So we're in the process of setting up a technology center in Barcelona, which will be the hub for many of our technology tools becoming scalable and deployed in our countries of focus, in countries where we work at the behest of the head of state or the head of government. This slide captures a few of our products that are currently in development. Top left corner, I already spoke about it. It's real-time connectivity monitoring, which easily links to the bottom right-hand corner, Giga Count. It's a platform to take into account real-time connectivity data and then trigger payments to service providers based on smart contracts. So this approach actually eliminates the room for human error. It bulletproofs government resources and ensures that funds are really spent for the services that is vital in all of these communities. Infrastructure analysis, top right-hand corner, is essential for us to design and define optimal technology solutions for value for money, for optimal connectivity in every corner of the world. And connectivity credits is another pilot, another technology-enabled pilot that we're working on, which should incentivize private sector to join the Giga initiative and connect more schools, essentially because working on connectivity in our model, in our data-driven, open source technology-enabled model holds so much promise, not just for digital education, but for any other development initiative that international organizations devote talent, skills, and resources to. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions coming from the audience.
Thank you, Maria. So if I could actually request all the panelists to come back on with their cameras. There are a bunch of very interesting questions. Some I've tried to answer, and I think some Tina and Catherine have also put in some responses. Let me start with one which I think is in multiple questions, but the thread is the same. Can AI technologies really help with predicting huge crises such as the COVID pandemic just we had, right? Or is it really only useful for things that are more routine, run-of-the-mill kind of crises and problems? So what's your take on this? Can it actually be useful in these kind of global crisis situations, or is it only more of a data-rich routine problem-solving environment where AI technologies can help? What's the UN perspective? Tina, do you want to take a shot at it? I think you also had a response in the text earlier.
Sure, I'm happy to try. I mean, I think kind of, obviously, as you mentioned very much before in the introduction, predicting events that have not occurred before is very difficult, right? So, but I think where the UN can certainly do a good job and where AI can help with that is how do we respond to crisis, right? Because there are environmental crises, there are health crises, and they'll be occurring over and over again in this world. So how can we, when we see them, detect them faster, probably not predict them, but detect them faster and find ways of responding more effectively and efficiently, right? A couple of the comments in the chat related to, how did AI, how did organizations use AI technology to address the COVID crisis? There was a lot of different apps developed that, for diagnosis. I think there's a big leap in global health these days of how AI-assisted tools can help diagnosis, can help prevention, but also in terms of predicting migration patterns. I think contamination, the spread of the virus, I mean, this is certainly something where AI can be really, really helpful. And there, the question is, again, how do we collaborate, not only across organizations, but then also I think governments play a real role, because as Maria mentioned to us before, there's some parts of the world where Giga does not get data. We know that many countries are very poor in terms of collaborating on data, some for obvious reason. Of course, there's privacy, there are ethical issues involved, but of course, to address these global challenges, we need global collaboration also in terms of data sharing. And that's, I think, a very tricky one. So that's my perspective on the topic.
Thank you, Tina. Catherine, do you want to add something to that?
I fully agree with Tina. I mean, I think the organizations are moving more and more towards trying to become predictive organizations rather and proactive to addressing a lot of the problems that they're dealing with. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're moving in the right direction. I agree with Tina that it's an ecosystem approach that's required, particularly as we start to scale. And this is where, and I think there was a couple other questions related to data, talent acquisition, data management, cybersecurity. I think it's all going to come down to these partnerships that we can build and a broader approach that can be taken there.
And I particularly like the point Tina made that we don't have the data to be able to predict when the next pandemic will come or what might be the virus that drives it. But we have enough data to say how diffusion will occur, right? We should be able to predict which hospitals will be the first to be overrun. We should be able to predict which cities are at more risk of diffusion. So that's the way to think about these problems. We can't predict the real rare events, but we can predict the consequences, which can often be quite similar across different kinds of events. I'd add one more point, which is the point I keep pushing also with my MBA and PhD students. The right benchmark for this kind of question is, could a human have predicted it? Right? Because at the end of the day, we are also prediction machines and we rely on data as well. We call it life experience and we use algorithms. We call it our thinking. But in the end, we are also making predictions based on past data. And the reason we do so well as we do is because to a large extent, tomorrow is like yesterday. If that wasn't true about the world, then none of us could function, right? But it also means at the same time, all of us, whether humans or algorithms, are going to struggle with things that haven't happened before. But that's not a cause for despair. That's really the point that Tina is making. All right. There was another particular question from Atif, which is, I think, for Maria to handle. So Atif made this observation about many projects in the IO kind of world, sometimes being pushed across without adequate access to data. And that can then result in, not satisfactory implementation. What's been your experience in the Giga project, right? What are you doing to overcome these data limitations?
Thanks so much, Phanish, for that question, but also to Atif for raising it. I think it's not too distant past when most of the international organizations would approach designing development assistance with an air of snobbishness, if I might use that word, you know, sitting in a very cushy office and thinking through how can I help the world today, but really doing it based on insufficient evidence. The first premise of the innovation movement is that you want to solve actual problems. So if, you know, it's Einstein who said it, probably everybody probably is familiar with that quote. You know, if I had 1 hour to solve a problem, I would think about, you know, 55 minutes, I would think about what the problem actually is, and I would spend 5 minutes on coming up with a solution. That's also what the Giga team is doing. We don't move a single dollar unless we have the data to justify that programmatic choice. So it really is a startup in a way that we, when we go into technology explorations, we carefully design pilots so that donor resources are not squandered on things that are not feasible, not effective, not needed. We do spend probably at this time an inordinate amount of time talking to governments, explaining the benefits of this data-driven approach, and walking technical folks through the data schema, because data is so crucial to what we're trying to achieve. It's not always easy. In some areas of the world, there is reticence to share data, but if we don't have the location of the school versus the respective location of the fiber node, we cannot even design how that cable would go, how crucial gigabytes would flow to communities. In some parts of the world, there are issues with security, especially in areas where there, you know, if you live on a border with a neighboring country, and that actually disclosing your location or the location of 2,000 school-age children would present security risks. But there are, for these kinds of issues, there are workarounds. What we also bring to the table is automation, in the sense that let's use the best of technology. Let's ensure that technology equalizes opportunities for the world, and it reduces the chance to siphon resources out of the development sphere or out of the public good sphere. So it's not always easy, but the power and evidence of our technology tools, and they speak for themselves.
Thank you. I want to add also that you know, the machine learning based AI is clearly very data hungry. We've said that, all of us have said that multiple times. And data shortage really comes down to one of two things. Either we aren't collecting the data, or somebody's collecting it, but they don't want to share it, right? Now, if you aren't collecting the data, that's a fairly typical business problem, in the sense you need to start collecting it. There will be a CapEx investment now, there'll be a payback period, and we have to price it out and see whether or not this makes sense, right? Like any other project. If it's the second problem, where the data exists somewhere, but we can't access because of confidentiality reasons, I think there's a lot of very smart development happening now around data disguising. So one of these I just want to mention quickly is this idea of synthetic data. So what is synthetic data? So let's say I have data on my company employees, and I am monitoring them, and I can see who's quitting and who's not. So I'm tracking attrition, okay? I want to use this data to be able to better predict which employees are at risk of quitting. But I don't want to share any confidential information. I want to protect their privacy. So what I can do is build a model that captures the patterns in my data, and then use that model to create new data as predictions. So these are synthetic, they're not real people, right? But because the patterns are being preserved, I can then give the model to another company who can now use that data and work with it without knowing anything about my employees. So we are getting smarter, I think, about how to use data while still being compliant with things like the GDPR. So I'm actually quite optimistic in this space. All right, let's look at a couple of other questions. If any of my panelists have favorite questions they see there, I think it would be great if you can also flag it. I'm going to pick one as well. Yeah, go for it, Tina.
So may I just connect to this and relating to a question that was in the chat. also in terms of, what are the main obstacles or risks that international organizations see for the use of AI and adoption of AI. And I think what the Giga project doing here is fantastic, but we also have to be very conscious. This is a very particular project. It's also a kind of a partnership project between UNICEF and ITU, and it has also a lot of private sector backing, and it's a very innovative governance model as such. But if you look into kind of the mainstream work of international organizations, especially the humanitarian organizations we work with, they're really, really concerned about two factors. One is the ethics around it, like privacy, data protection that Phanish just mentioned. I mean, just talking about refugees and their identities and, people that need protection, children, and so on. So they're very sensitive to what data we can use, and are kind of very risk averse in terms of what risks do we want to take in the sector, partly for a lack of understanding, partly I think also for very good reasons, because there is this this responsibility for vulnerable parts of the population. The second element that we're seeing a lot is that international organizations have very rigid decision-making processes, very political decision-making processes, and often kind of giving away this decision-making to like an algorithm or a tool. They feel very uncomfortable with this, and I think many companies who kind of have a more conservative culture can maybe relate to this. So I think this idea of being accountable for each and every decision-making process, this is very hard to let go of. And this is, I think, the same in the private sector as well as for international organizations. But I think this is a particular obstacle, that there's always this fear of loss of control, of loss of management control that organizations are seeing, which I think is something that we really need to address in the governance, in the mechanisms, and kind of what decisions can be taken, what decisions cannot be taken in a certain area.
I think that's really a very important point to underline, that the ethical constraint that comes up in every organization that uses data. In the international organization world, it really comes up very strong, right? Because most of the people working in these organizations have chosen for various reasons to work in them rather than in the for-profit sector, for reasons having to do with their values and sense of purpose. So anything that appears to violate that is an absolute no-no. So in some sense, I think what these organizations like the UN come up with in terms of managing the ethical problems around AI can become the benchmark for other for-profit companies. So it may well be the crucible in which the most innovative ideas arise in this context. Maria, Catherine, would you have any questions you want to address in particular? Do you see any you like?
No,
Yeah,
Maria, go ahead.
go ahead. Thanks. I was just browsing through the chat and answering some questions. There was a question from Eric on the types of data other than high resolution satellite imagery that we use.
Yeah.
So I can answer that. We normally have two types of counterparts in each country where we support the government to pursue universal school connectivity. We usually work with ministries of education and ministries of ICT, or however that entity might be named in a specific country. Our main data points that we require to consider a country a Giga country and to launch our system of support is first the physical location of schools, and second the quality of their internet connection if it is available. That's the non-negotiable for Giga that gives us the insights that we need to proceed. And then the third type of data is obviously linked to future stages in the Giga journey, in the runway to connectivity. We also require information on where fiber nodes are installed and other connectivity infrastructure and how it reaches the country. That can give us the insights to start thinking about most cost-effective models for connectivity. There are a few other data points that pertain to how the market is shaped, but I would say these were the primary, the crucial data sets for us.
Thank you, Maria.
There's a question on some of the recent AI regulations and so forth. I think the UN could play a really intricate role there in boosting these regulations and so forth. So there was question on whether this is a risk or an opportunity. I would say this is an opportunity for the UN. I think, as we all saw in the digital cooperation roadmap of 2020 that was launched by Antonio Gutierrez, the UN is really positioning itself now as a global player for helping to develop this type of ethical role that Phanish mentioned. And I think this could be, if done correctly, really a new role that the UN can play globally. And I think we mentioned this as well in the report that Phanish just put in the chat. So if you haven't seen that already, please take a look. So this idea that the UN could actually help member states and governments start to implement artificial intelligence could be very interesting as well.
I should also point out that one of the things that came out in our study and also generalizes very well is adoption of AI is a very classic kind of digital transformation project, which doesn't happen unless there's strong support from the top. The reason being, it's a high capex investment. The payback period can be long, requires a lot of coordination across multiple actors. So of course, there's got to be bottom-up buy-in, but if there isn't strong championing from above, it doesn't work. And one of the things we discovered is the awareness and the kind of technical understanding, not necessarily technical skill, that you need to be a sophisticated consumer of AI is still very lacking, right? It's not really very widespread. The good news here, I think, is it's actually not very hard to take somebody with absolutely no prior background in data science or machine learning or stats, and in a few days, give them enough to be able to have a smart conversation with data scientists. That's totally possible, right? In fact, we have numerous programs that we run like this. Let me actually put one in the chat that you might want to take a look at as well. And what we do here is we really take people with no prior technical background and teach them the basics of how to think about machine learning as a sophisticated user. Not just about INSEAD here, I also want to flag a wonderful program in the Nordic countries called OpenAI. It's called AI for Everyone. I will find the link and put it in the chat as well. It's an introductory program which everybody from high school students to grandmothers and grandfathers can take. It's all online, and it's an excellent introduction to what AI really is, what machine learning is doing, and why it's important for every citizen to understand the fundamentals. So we do need a lot more emphasis on education around this as well. Tina?
Yes, thank you so much. And connecting to this, to what you said, the kind of the support from the top and the push from the bottom. In another study on, social initiatives in the UN, we found that especially those that are involving technology, you need to have the support from the top. That's very clear, but often these initiatives really start like bottom up from the field, from great ideas, from partnerships that are being developed at a local level. And what we find is, and I think this is a good reason for optimism for once, that really they have a lasting impact on the organization. If you pioneer initiatives in an organization, even bottom up, it will contribute to developing capabilities in the organization, will help to connect silos that were previously unconnected. So I think despite needing the support from the top, which is very clear, I think there's enormous power in these bottom-up movements that allow us to transform organizations and really build lasting capabilities. And I think especially this insourcing of technical talent and this kind of, first risk-taking of how can we integrate these different types of thinking, these different tools, these different people, I think that is something where, entrepreneurship, so bottom-up innovation has also proven to be very powerful. Thanks.
Okay, there's a couple of interesting questions around the misuse of AI, right? Particularly around hackers doing all kinds of unethical things, including, for instance, predicting and trying to shape elections or trying to steal data of various kinds. How do the international organizations think about this? I mean, Maria, you're handling very sensitive data, right? So what kind of protocols do you have in place to make sure this doesn't happen?
Sure, that's a very relevant question, Phanish. Thanks for raising it. I mean, I did indicate before that we work with national stakeholders. There's always quite a lot of effort put into explaining what type of data we need, what value will it generate, but then also safeguarding or understanding and preventing any possible security and other risks. So in our case, the Project Connect platform, which is the map that you see as my virtual background, is very powerful in the sense that it aggregates key data. It makes key data visible to the public, and it allows governments to plan their national development strategies, their budget allocations, so on and so forth. But it doesn't, we always anonymize data, we always aggregate data, and we take due care of the fact that our data heavy work doesn't create any risks for the communities that we serve. That has worked out well to date. When it comes to issues with sharing data in sensitive locations and displaying them on projecting, there are a few tips and tricks that we can use to make sure that the information is presented, but the level of accuracy that is shown isn't such that would endanger anyone, but it still allows us to conduct the necessary analysis.
Fantastic. I think we are literally out of time, and I don't want to keep this on schedule. I really want to thank my wonderful panelists, Maria, Catherine, Tina. Thank you so much. And it was great to work on this research project with you, Tina and Catherine. We hope we can do more of these going forward. I learned a lot, and I hope you got something out of it as well. Digital at INSEAD is going to reach out to all of you participants with a feedback form. And I want to underline that please use that form also to reach out to us. So if there's something you would like to connect with one or all of us on a particular topic you're working on, particular question you're interested in, we'd love to hear from you. So please do use that channel to also write up of your interest, and we'll definitely make it a point to reach back. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you at another webinar soon. Thank you.